I don't know if anyone actually cares about this, but I don't know what made me think about this the other day. Who killed the answering machine? Was there a product manager at a telco who was, oh, this is a thing that we could do and we could offer it as a service? Or I don't know, was it a side effect? Because I was thinking about answering machines, and at the time that we got voicemail, which I don't think was called voicemail in the mid 90s, but we had the ability to, you'd pick up the phone and you get the little three dot 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 sound to let you know you had a voicemail message. But was it because people were using dial-up internet, and so family members were getting a busy signal when they called? You couldn't even get to the answering machine, and so phone companies were trying to solve that problem? Was there some product person at a telco? I'm going to kill the answering machine. I've got this cool new idea. I want to understand the origin of that, because I don't know. My brain just wants to understand how things get started. And that one's super interesting to me.
If I think about it, and I guess, was it just somebody on autopilot? Like everything else has gone digital, everything else became a service. It's
Right.
a natural progression for this to become a service with no real deeper analysis of, I'm about to take away their ribbon from Excel and not really think about what it does to them.
Right.
I'm gonna take away this button. And so was he just a natural flowing down river with everything else? It got caught along?
But isn't that a massive infrastructure investment? You now have to suddenly host an entire environment that knows how to listen for the phone not being picked up by anybody after a certain number of calls, intercept and bring it back to the call center, have the call center then have the ability to record, then have the ability to tell the person you can dial into this number and hear. There's a whole process that goes into that. You had to go convince somebody to spend another, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars a year. And did we get charged for that as a new feature that you had to pay for? I was too young to know how that all worked. That's a whole thing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about it is maybe my lack of interest in it. As an architect, I've never really been responsible for building call centers, but my father is actually one of the foremost early architects of call centers. And so in the future, we should probably bring him on and ask him some of these questions.
Amazing. Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the Zoom from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
Fantastic.
We're also here to get deeper on the human elements. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people to do that.
Well, at least these two people. On this week's show, we'll be digging into how software teams are, or are not, working effectively in this new remote world. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break, and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call User Stories, where we'll eventually hopefully be answering questions that you, the listener, send in. But for now, I think we found some interesting questions on Quora that we can tackle. So today's question was asked by Nicole, and it is, how are remote teams supposed to communicate effectively, and what are the actual legitimate arguments for software engineering teams working remotely? I think we should start with the first half of that, the communication problems. Feel like communication, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Communication feels like it's just half of it. It is not just how we communicate, but how people cope and deal with the lack of human interaction, and maybe better communication helps solve that. How narrow or broad is your version of this topic?
I like to think it's a broad topic based on personal experience, with the caveat that my sampling is obviously short time frame. I think what I'm seeing day to day as part of the software development lifecycle, I'm starting to see changes, and that gets into the messenger and the role of email, which I think was a pre-COVID question for me too. What is the role of email, and how has that changed with the introduction of products like Teams and Slack? So I think it's a broad subject. It includes travel and geolocation, hiring. I came down to South Florida several years ago and was able to hire in ways that I wouldn't have been able to hire in a pre-COVID world, and that really saved the organization for me because I was able to hire people in the Northwest, in the Northeast. So I was able to change the hiring patterns of companies. So I think it's a really broad subject.
So one, does anyone use email anymore? Like I know I get work emails, but I don't. Those are usually from outside people or boomers. Like, how is email still a thing?
For our listeners, a boomer needs needs
Everyone
no
knows what a boomer
explanation.
is.
But yeah, so I struggle in the same way you do, and maybe we could maybe we could self reflect and cross examine our problems to come up with an answer. Yeah, I just fundamentally have a problem with email, and maybe I push the culture locally in my teams to be a little bit more messenger based. I've always liked the immediate news, so the messenger works better for me.
What's fascinating to me though is when you actually look at it, there is very little speed difference between an email and a Slack message. That email shows up to you in the exact same amount of speed as Slack, but for some reason I don't know if it's the email clients all suck because they're stuck on a user interface paradigm that hasn't changed since AOL in the 90s and 80s. Technically, there's no difference between email and a Slack message. It arrives, I mean, maybe there's a slight delay sometime in some of the conversation, but really not noticeably. If you're really emailing back and forth with somebody, it's nearly as quick as if you were doing it on Slack. But the interface method is so cumbersome and is so backwards. And I wonder if that's, I don't know, because I hate email and never want to talk that way. But if you actually think about it, I don't know, it's like is it a UI problem?
I actually think what you're saying is true. If you're conversing with somebody who has the same expectations as you, I can see Kevin is typing. And that is important to me because it means you're responding. So I don't get that through email. So though
Sure.
you sent me an email and I may see it within 30 seconds, in my mind, I know that once I respond to you, it could be 45 minutes, it could be 3 weeks, it may never come. So I'm not trusting that we're in a conversation where you're as committed to responding as quickly as I am.
Technically, that's not true of Slack, though. You absolutely could get a read receipt that this person saw the message, but they're in a meeting and you're not going to get a response for 45 minutes. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think it's really interesting that somehow the fact that we have the potential for immediacy is somehow better for our brains, even though I don't know that it's actually that different than the email, other than the three
Yeah, that's
dots.
interesting. And I won't say I'm this way. I know I am. But if I saw that you had read my message and didn't respond right away, depending on the importance level of that message, I might feel pretty exposed, or a little frustrated with somebody who doesn't respond to me right away. Also, the other features at mention, right? If I at mention you, there's an expectation for me that Kevin's email box is 1,500 emails long today. He's going to struggle to even see my message. But if I use a messaging app and I at mention him, it's going to pop right up in his notification. So I think you're right. I think the difference between the interface and my expectations of the visibility.
I think it's funny too that the last couple of versions of Outlook have allowed you to at message somebody in the body of the message, and then it doesn't show up anywhere and doesn't help you filter your inbox or anything. It's super perplexing. There's so many product managers I just want to talk to and be like, why'd you make this decision? Why can I at reply somebody in the body of an email and then Outlook doesn't do anything more intelligent with that? What is going on there?
Yeah, talk to product managers and some reasoning and some logic behind these designs. That's 25 years I've been asking myself those questions. Yeah, we built it.
Genuinely, we need to get this podcast to be so popular that product managers are listening to it and want to come talk to us. We'll keep it anonymous so that they can, not get fired. But I need to know. I need to understand decisions that are going into some of these things.
Yeah, because I look on the technology side. Sure, yeah, we built it, but you designed it.
Okay, we're in a remote world. It's great for being able to hire the people you want to hire. It's great for being able to give people the flexibility that they might need for their schedules and things like that. But does everybody use Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever they're using to communicate effectively? What are the downsides you're worried about in this remote world?
I don't think the issue was introduced with COVID and the new methods of communication. I think the problems were there before. there are certain individuals I wouldn't necessarily have them lead team meetings, but it would be more evident in person in the office. You can sit there and there's a sense of, you can look around the room, you can feel the energy levels. The post-COVID world where we do these things through Teams and through COVID, I can actually hide myself. So imagine sitting in a room physically and somebody very similar to a Black Mirror episode could fuzz themselves out. So I don't see their face, I don't see their presence, I just see a blur of them. It's very
Right.
difficult now to read the physical cues of somebody on how engaged they are. And in Teams and Slack, you can quite literally turn your camera off and not say anything for the entire time the meeting's in session. And now I don't have those cues. I don't know if the person is necessarily engaging everybody because they've closed themselves off. I can certainly tell from the content, like, this is not engaging me, but am I the only one who feels that? So now there's some self-doubt. Like, do I step in and control this meeting? Is everybody else getting something out of it? And I think they're the subtle ways in which we've worked in the past with those physical and visual cues, even audio cues, and those have changed. Those have changed dramatically.
I think I agree, but I also, is it just the cues have changed? I think they're not gone, though. The engineer who might have sat in the corner of the room and not participated and added anything to the conversation during sprint planning, their camera being off or them being silent on Zoom is kind of, it's just a different signal. But I'm not sure, you know what, I'm trying to figure out if it just means we need to change our way of observing those things. But I do wonder that they're still offering you the signals. Do you think the person would have reacted differently in the room, and because of this weird form of communication and certain personalities that they just aren't? Do you think the people who were quiet in the room are not necessarily the ones who are going to be quiet on Zoom, or vice versa? I don't know. I'm trying to figure out.
No,
If
they're not the ones I'm worried about.
Okay.
The people who are quiet in the room and who are also quiet in the meeting, that's their default stance. That's the like for like. I'd say, though, the people that I'd be concerned about are the ones that engage in person. They're able to step up in front of the whiteboard, and that's where they excel. That is their, just in the same way I talk about my people leadership and being face to face with people. I always like to think that that was part of my skill set. The architect who is much more open and engaged and energized, standing in front of a whiteboard, that's gone for them now, right? And I shouldn't say it's gone, but it changed dramatically. It doesn't have the same effect. Even if you build them the feature that allows them to whiteboard in a meeting, that is not the same adrenaline rush. They don't get the same release of endorphins that got them hooked on their job in the first place. That is gone, right? And we struggle to replace that. They're the people I'm worried about.
Interesting. Have you found anything that helps those folks, or is this an open question for the industry?
I've played with different methods. I've tried virtual reality, augmented reality. I've had some success there, though there's still a barrier of entry for virtual reality and augmented reality.
Also, you just look dumb in your house just with a giant set of goggles over your head. I suppose you're probably relatively alone in your home office, so no one knows you look dumb, but that is probably also a barrier. You look like a moron.
To be
Andrew.
clear,
That's all I'm saying.
I know this is a podcast. I look dumb without the virtual reality headset. So it's just an increase in the dumbness. I think accountability, there are people who excel at leadership in different, sometimes it doesn't even matter the medium, right? They excel in person, they can drive meetings. And I think the challenge has really fallen on them to control those meetings. And some people just consistently, I like to think Kevin Newland, who I've known many years, is the type of person who he may not own the meeting, but he's continually contributing not only to the content of the meeting, the structure, the efficiency, potentially the next steps. So it's starting to fall on those gifted individuals who can control those meetings. But I question the effectiveness of that because, one, you can't be in every meeting, or those types of people can't be in every meeting. And two, is that good for culture? Is the culture climbing with them? Are people like recognizing that and saying, I want to be more like Kevin? And are those people, do they have the time then to lead that evolution and guide people in how to run better communications?
So first, thank you for our mandated per episode praise of me. I will Venmo you later. I think that's interesting because it's not, to your point, you were in Florida hiring people from all across the country. What do you do in this situation? I've seen people do icebreakers at the start of meetings, and sometimes they feel a little bit goofy. You ask 3 questions and everybody has to type in the chat or say out loud and try to engage people in different ways. But I am sort of curious how not everything's going to be solved by tooling. Sometimes it has to be a leader of the meeting saying, I'm not going to be the one to talk right now. I'm going to call on somebody. That can be slightly awkward too. I'm super curious how we get those people to be more comfortable, because I don't love the term post-COVID because the thing's still around. We still got our boosters that we need to get, and it's going to be, a chronic recurring thing like the flu shot from now on, basically. But in the current state of the world, a bunch of people who got hired remotely, I'm in Seattle, you're in Florida, everyone's all over the place. It's not like I'm looking forward to, well, in June, I'll be back in the office. That's not a reality for a bunch of people. So the solution has to become, how do you get people in this not virtual, like, wearing a headset over your head, but in the current remote scenario, how do we get people to do that? Is it leadership being a little bit uncomfortable and calling on people to force them to talk about things and get them engaged again? I don't know.
Yeah, here's where my technical mind kicks in is, what are the inputs to the meeting and what are the outputs? What were the expectations of the meeting? And so I boiled it down to, the meeting is really the method, and then what are the parameters it takes, and then what is my output of that meeting? We didn't necessarily have that before. I think I'm starting to see, certainly in my current climate, individuals who are leading us in that direction. And again, I don't have a broad enough sample to know if that's just energized people I work with today, or whether this is people saying, hey, now the problem is much more emphasized because Conway's Law is much more apt to happen in this current climate, with us disconnecting and not talking to each other through the day.
This is Kevin from the future while editing this episode, just popping in to explain what Conway's Law is. To quote Melvin E. Conway on How Do Committees Invent? Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. Basically, the way people work is going to be the way people build things, and so it ends up building systems that are sometimes actually just duplicating what you're doing already, rather than being something truly innovative and new. All right, back to the episode. This is Kevin popping in from even farther in the future to say, yes, I'm fully stealing this little bit from Kirk Hamilton of the Great Triple Click podcast. So thank you for the idea of doing this fun little sound effect. All right, now really back to the episode.
So I'm starting to see a little bit more structure on the technical meetings, where it's like, what is the input to this meeting? What is the expected output? And I'm starting to see like a commitment to things that I thought would never really resurface, which is not quite UML, not to the standard of the old waterfall type documentation, but I'm starting to see engineers say, this is the data flow and the process flow diagram that I expect from product in the next meeting that I go to. And from that, now I can create my data flow and my system component diagram. And I'm hoping that this is part of the solving of the problem of only talking through video calls infrequently through the day, versus I can hear you over the cube wall, let's hit the whiteboard. So I'm starting to see that in my current environment, and it'll be interesting to hear what our listeners are seeing. Has anybody solved this problem? Is anybody else seeing a change in behavior that is potentially related to how we work remote today?
That's interesting. So yeah, I was trying to find ways to make sure that we're thinking about how is this affecting software development and what's going on. And I think that's an interesting point around, if I was able to, just as a product person, go ask 2 minutes worth of questions over the cube wall to the engineer, the next cube over, and just understand a thing and then go back and make sure my user story was different and slightly tweaked for that. We need to whiteboard out a thing, and the whiteboarding out of the thing, helps the engineer think through what they're going to have to do, versus now if we're remote, all of that goes away. And so now is part of that solution. As a product person, there's so much value in that conversation and that whiteboard and that quick thing. And some of that does still happen as a Slack message and things like that. And I'm sure if there's some, Agile Manifesto diehard out there who's like, that's not what you're supposed to do. We won't work quickly and evolve our software fast if we, revert more towards waterfall stuff. But I think that's an interesting point, that in that remote world, what is the alternative?
It's interesting you say that because having worked with you and seen product managers talk to us over the cube wall, I think the interesting piece that's missing for me today would be the process. The journey was important. A product manager pulling me to the whiteboard to have a conversation was as much about the evolution of them as it was about the evolution of the
Right.
feature. So it was, how do I work with this product manager, right? Who in my team has stopped what they're doing to contribute? Am I seeing my UI and UX designer suddenly stop to contribute to a back end conversation? And is that an indicator that that person is more general and I can rely on them in the future? Those small indicators to me have changed. I don't get that same experience of seeing the journey and understanding those little nuances about the people in my organization. I think in the Teams and Slack setting today, I'm not as apt to see those people speak up, maybe because, yeah, maybe it's just one, it could just not be their preferred medium, or two, they feel that, well, this is very structured. It's not ad hoc like it used to be at the whiteboard. And so there's less likelihood of coming off mute to contribute to something that technically, they're not technically responsible for. So I think it was the journey for me.
Well, and there's fewer opportunities for that, right?
Absolutely.
I don't get to overhear the conversation. If I go and just directly Slack the engineer I know is going to have the answer for me, the three other engineers on that team who might be more junior or might not be related, but to your point, might be able to contribute to it, don't see that interaction. And so that's an interesting thing of, do these teams need to, don't have, it's, well, the problem I have with what I'm about to say is it adds to the noise, which might make communication harder, but it's almost like what you need to have is the engineering team Slack channel that anyone can post into and all of the engineers can see. And so as the product person, as the UX person, as whoever it is wants to have that conversation with just the one engineer, don't go and have the Slack conversation with the one engineer. Post it somewhere that the entire team gets to be able to see it and contribute towards it. And in a general thing, I'll just say, whatever environment you're in, if you're in an office with people or you're working remotely, product managers, hi, I'm one of you. Go talk to your engineers. Go talk to your UX folks. Have more conversations than you do today. To Andrew's point earlier, it'll make you a better product manager by having those conversations with folks, and it'll make their output better because you're talking to them more frequently. And I will now get off my soapbox.
Yeah, and again, my final point would be the subtlety between the written word and the spoken word. And as somebody who is can be extremely repetitive, part of the reason why I become extremely repetitive is I'm often saying the same things in three different ways. One, because I recognize that my audience has three different ways of understanding what I'm saying. It can be an analogy, or, hey, I'm relating this back to you in a way that I tried to relay back to you last week about a different problem. See the connection between these two patterns. So I think that's important as well. If I was to write what I just said, do I have the energy to do that? And that throughout the day, is the magnitude of that is probably escaping us, and we're not realizing what I can say in 2 minutes is not actually getting written down many, many, many times because people don't have the energy to write the detail they need to.
Well, yeah, if you're me, you write 4 different drafts of the email because I'm trying to figure out how to get the core concept across to as many people as possible. Well, this version of the sentence doesn't work. Let me rewrite it and say it this way. Let me use this analogy instead of that one. I mean, you're right. So if I normally could just have that conversation versus I'm going to try to find 7 different ways to write this little Slack message, I'm probably just going to not write the Slack message.
Yeah, it can be incredibly subtle. The sentence that I say with a tone of humor to an executive board, which is powerful because it's not necessarily a joke, but I say it with humor to help people accept how serious what I'm saying is. When you write those words, I question whether they get written at all, because I think most people can deliver bad news in a way that is acceptable that they would never write. It's just
Right.
lost. And I think that to me is subtle, but I think it's overwhelmingly powerful in changing the way we behave in a remote world.
I do appreciate I don't know that this is actually working, but Slack introducing that little huddle feature where you're just doing a quick audio chat right through the app and you don't have to spin up a whole thing and start the meeting and turn the video on, making it a quick little, let's just have this quick conversation. I've at least seen that that can help that. I think it's still a barrier. It's still not truly solving it, but it was helpful for me at least.
And that's interesting that because for a lot of us that's not something new in the DevOps space. And for our listeners, I was one of the what would be described as a one of the earliest DevOps engineers probably in the country back in the early 2000s.
Ooh, fancy.
And we used products like TeamSpeak in the old days,
Hmm.
where we'd be on the channel all day but muted, and we did that because of remote. I actually was based in Europe. My team was scattered through the US, different regions of the US, and so we used TeamSpeak in the same fashion as huddles today.
I'm curious if so I thought this and I thought it was successful, but I'm curious if you actually did. So when we were in the Burlington office together, and I laid out that office plan, and I had all of us together with half wall cubes so that at any given point, anyone could literally just pop their head up and ask a question of another engineer. I also wanted that for the tech support team, but the tech support team was on the phone enough that we needed some sound dampening. But that ability to just quickly get an answer from a person, just be able to collaborate on a thing literally over the cube wall, made sense to me. I don't know if it actually worked for you. I'm wondering if people are used to being in offices with high cube walls and you need to actually get up from your desk, go walk down the 5 cubes to go and have the conversation with the person, versus what I was trying to foster was I could literally just peer over your head to Sergey and say really quickly, hey, what's going on? And I'd get an answer. I'm curious if that one worked for you, and two, if that's part of the barrier to why people don't think of something like a team huddle, because that's not how their offices usually are. They usually have to think of communicating with someone else as a physical activity that you need to go and do, and that's a barrier.
Yeah, I would say it worked for me, and I'll explain why in a second. I'm not sure if I can say that my way is the way or the correct way, but I can tell you why it worked for me. It was, and I love it, by the way. I think in certainly in our jobs at that time, it was critical, and one of the reasons was that it's not only that I can see an engineer, it's me restructuring my day to say I'm actually going to talk to them about this right now, and I could explain the alternative, which is I get up from my cube, I walk 3 cubes down, and then the person's not there, but this is
Mhm.
my spare 30 minutes, and now I have to rearrange the next hour or two in my mind because that person's not there, right? And so that's important to me because I love the visual cues to say, okay, I can go talk to Kevin in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. He doesn't look like when someone is about to go in a meeting, you can sort of tell and say, hey, are you
Right.
leaving? Because I got something really important to tell you. So the way I work is sort of full featured. It's visual, it's audio. If I'm hearing conversations over my cube, I can jump in. But I'm also using those visual cues. How energized are the juniors today, right? Like, are they going somewhere, and do I need to talk to them about that right now? So it worked for me. Like, I can't imagine it any other way. And I do know the feeling of that. I'm going to talk to somebody across the room, and I arrive at their empty cube, and I think to myself, well, that just stinks because now I have to rearrange the next hour because I needed them before I go into this meeting.
So then, is the concept of being able to do, whether it's your always on huddle or even just having that flexibility to think, oh, what I should be able to do is somehow feel comfortable in the idea that I can spontaneously talk to a person through audio, video, whatever it is, and not have to rely just on a Slack message? Is that a thing that can help people get better team communication when you're remote? Is somehow finding that way to reduce that barrier to know this is a conversation that should happen. I don't need to drop a note to you. But to your point, especially now that we're remote, it's even harder. I can't look at the cube over the cube wall and see that Andrew is there. Just because you're green on Slack doesn't mean you're necessarily there. You might be deep in the middle of coding or writing a spec or doing something else. I don't know what that, how do you discover someone's availability for that conversation?
Yeah, and I think the closest I've come in the last few years to doing that has been the war rooms. So
Hmm.
there's energy to arrange it ahead of time and make sure you have the right participants in there. But it has worked, right? Throughout the day, being able to say, hey, you're not needed in the war room between 10 a.m. and noon, but can you be available between 2 and 4 at any point in time? We may pull you into that. But I have seen it work. I've seen successes with war rooms.
Interesting.
There's just more prep up front.
Sure. So the thing I've been struggling with is balancing that what it feels like the new answer is more frequent, broader groups that need to talk to one another. So because as a product manager, I can't just walk over and get a quick question answered and go back to my desk and tweak my user story and add 2 bullet points to the acceptance criteria, then what needs to happen is these teams need to figure out whether it's weekly or some kind of cadence to get all of the folks in the room, and at this point it's in the Zoom, and all talking through what's going on. And the problem is, well, depending, if I'm working on 4 different features, then I need to be in 4 different weekly meetings, and even weekly sometimes doesn't feel like it. Almost needs to be like a daily 15-minute stand-up about this feature that we're all trying to work on, and that also kind of sucks. So I'm not sure what I think the solution is yet, but I do think because we've lost that ability to have those quick, I can just spot that Andrew's in his cube. That means I can walk over and go ask him the quick question. Getting that kind of collaboration, I just said the word collaboration, but getting that kind of, ability to share information, talk to one another, it means that more people all need to be involved earlier and more frequently. And I don't know how you do that, because then you run into meeting fatigue and it starts to get to be too much. But I think you're right. I think the places we've been successful is creating these little squads of a product manager, an engineering lead, a UX person. You're all talking through what needs to happen more frequently and more process oriented. We purposefully put a meeting on the books to have this conversation at 11 o'clock. We all know we need to show up and do that, because the alternative is the UX person asks a random Slack question on Monday. The product manager asks a similar adjacent question in Slack on Tuesday, and we could have all just had this conversation together. I don't know. I don't know what that answer is.
Yeah, and I think you've essentially just pointed out a lot of companies now have crowdsourced through and introduced meeting fatigue, right? That we're starting to see an increase in the audience, and it's become just sort of, no holds barred, free for all. Everybody kind of has a say, and there are things that you just definitely don't want me to have a say in, right?
I mean, I don't want you to have a say in a lot of things, Andrew.
Trust me, my internal voice is telling me don't say anything at times.
It's not that I disagree. It's that what we were talking about earlier, where someone could overhear the whiteboard conversation and chime in and add the extra thing. You lose those opportunities to find that out. But you're right. If all of a sudden this is a waste of someone's 30 minutes when they should be productive doing something else, how do you balance that opportunity to find out that the UX person actually might have a really interesting idea for the back end and how it should work? You lose those opportunities.
And that's a perfect example. If I'm standing at a whiteboard with Kevin Newland, I have the visual cues of whether he's paying attention. And Kevin Newland is going to stop me and say, no, that's not what we're talking about. Let's get back to the conversation. In a meeting, I don't know if you're multitasking. And did we just miss an opportunity for Kevin to say, well, no, that's not what we're talking about. And And they're the subtle things that's how we communicate, right? Those leaders shape the conversation day to day in at the whiteboard, in person. And I think we're missing that today. And I think we're missing opportunities, but I haven't given up hope.
So our answer for today is remote work is terrible. Everyone should go back to the office.
I'd like the option, but yeah, I definitely am somebody who would like the option to. I would probably work from home 3 days a week, but I'd like the choice.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think it also takes a commitment, like you're saying, from individuals, but also the company itself. So one of the things I really appreciate at one of the companies I worked at right as COVID was happening was sort of this commitment from the company that everybody, if we're going to do this, we need to make it actually work. And one of the things that meant was everyone got sent headphones and a microphone. And that meant that one of the weird things that happens in a Zoom meeting or whatever video software you use is if you're going through a speaker that can hear your microphone, or no, if your microphone can hear your speakers, so like your laptop, the Zoom will cut you off or cut the person off who's talking, depending on whether you're talking or listening. And so what ends up happening is no one can hear you because they're still talking. And so meetings turn into a bunch of just like, wait, what was that? Sorry, can you say that again? Versus if you have headphones and a microphone, that doesn't happen. Zoom lets you talk over one another and you all hear the conversation much more naturally. And so that kind of, like, it's a relatively small, well, I won't say relatively small, depending on how big your company is. That's several $1,000s worth of, hardware shipping out to people. But it's those kinds of little things of a commitment to saying, everyone's going to get this. And by the way, don't join a meeting unless you've got your headphones in so that we don't, get clipped and we can actually talk to one another. Small little things like that also matter. And I think, to your point, it has to be a commitment from everybody that we're going to make this work.
Yeah, and I think you hit an important point there. I don't think you should diminish those small things, because if you equate it back to literature, something like Atomic Habits, it is the 1,500 little things that you change that bring the efficiency, right? It's not the one gigantic change and saying, hey, this is it, this is the big change, this is going to make all the difference. I actually do think it's these small changes, but with the benefit that, if they stink, you can always roll those things back, right? So I do think it's those little things. It's difficult to measure the importance of those, because if you take enough of those things, that is the evolution I'm looking for, right?
Sure. Interesting. Anything else we should talk about on this?
No, COVID is bad.
Yeah. I feel like we didn't draw too many conclusions in this discussion, so check out the blog post linked in the show notes for some more concrete recommendations. All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. If you liked what you heard, maybe go and drop 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a nice review. And if you didn't like what you heard, remember the name of the podcast is The Doughboys. Also, tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there grow by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it. And a friendly reminder that we are always interested in hearing questions directly from you, the listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app just updated everything and it's now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. Just send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking to a coworker or something. Follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky. We're at AcceptancePod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog there. For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at KThomasEuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER. And this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.